Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Evenings with Steve. I want to wish everyone a happy Passover. I should tell you that symbolically, on my drive to the synagogue tonight, I confronted a hailstorm. So one of the 10 plagues hit me personally before the program. We have just a wonderful program tonight. I just spent 15 minutes alone with our guest, and I think we could have taken the 15 minutes that I just spent with him and used it for the program. It was so fabulous. But I just wanted to tell you that we had music, of course, John Legend and Norah Jones before the program, and we'll also have music after the program. If you just want to relax, have a juice or a glass of wine for about 20 minutes, we'll play some melodic and beautiful music. Just listening to Norah Jones by herself is just worth it all alone. So let me introduce our guest. He is a Canadian documentary filmmaker, and I think it's fair to say that he's the best. You know, he isn't just a Canadian documentary filmmaker. I think he's the best in Canada. That's my view. And Barry Avrich, welcome once again to Evenings with Steve. We're so delighted that you can be with us again to talk about one of your spectacular movies.
Thank you, Steve. Nice to be here.
So I have to tell you, first of all, that you win the award this year for the best backdrop because no one has come close to you. So why don't you just tell us what the backdrop is?
The backdrop is when I was making a documentary a few years ago called Made You Look about the largest art fraud in American history, which involved fake Rothkos and Jackson Pollocks and Motherwells and Diebenkorns. And when we were traveling through China, working through this mystery, we found a factory in Shenzhen that makes paintings, fake paintings, and you can pretty much order whatever you like. And so I figured I was there, and for $600, I got a Jackson Pollock that is the exact same size as the one that hangs in MoMA. And the exact same painting pretty much. And so I've had experts look at it and go, boy, that's amazing. So this is in my boardroom at my office, and people come in to the office and go, wait a minute, is that and I just never let them finish. Yeah. Yes, it is.
Okay, well, you win the prize. So let me ask you, first of all, before we get to the Oscar Peterson film,
yeah,
you always have projects on the go. So I understand you have a film opening May the 1st at TIFF. Tell us about that and tell us what other projects loom ahead.
Well, lots. I mean, the beautiful thing about documentary, Steve, is that, and why I've sort of chosen the genre of documentary versus scripted is that you sort of can control the process and which I like versus getting, 8,000 pages of notes on casting and art direction and whatnot. And there's so many stories. There's always another story that somebody's either pitching me or that I've discovered. So yes, on May 1st, I have a new film opening at Hot Docs called The Talented Mr. Rosenberg. And it was inspired by a Vanity Fair style story that I read in Toronto Life about this career-long con artist that's been living in Toronto, but has sort of global footprint being a real swindler. And so and I was making this before Inventing Anna and The Tinder Swindler and all these other sort of films and series that people have become obsessed with. But yes, there is one in Canada, and he is beyond fascinating. And he sits down with me in this film, as does many of his victims, to talk about his life as a con artist, a swindler. And we hear from his ex-wives, his children, and victims on what it's like to have encountered him. And also the wonderful Diana Henriquez, who wrote Wizard of Lies and visited Bernie Madoff in jail, is in the film too. And she's sort of studied Rosenberg, again, a Toronto guy. As my late grandfather would say, why did he have to be Jewish? Why did he have to be Jewish? And what can I tell you? He is. So that's May 1st at Hot Docs. I'm in production and development on a whole bunch of other things. One of the ones I'm excited about too is that I'm doing a documentary on Rosalia Bella, the recent retired Supreme Court judge who's now teaching, I think, at Fordham, and then going to Harvard, and just a spectacular Canadian, but global pioneer in equal rights and freedom. And so I'm thrilled to be working on that too.
Right. She received a humanitarian award from Beth Sholem, and I'd like to invite you right now next year to have you back to deal with that documentary. Because truly, just as Oscar Peterson's a Canadian icon, so is Rosalie Abella in a very different world in the legal.
Agreed.
Okay. All right. Well, we have a commitment for a guest for next year, ladies and gentlemen. So
it'll be my pleasure to come back to your show.
No. Okay. So we're gonna spend the rest of the program talking about Oscar Peterson. And before we come to that, I just wanted to ask you if you had a love for jazz, because we're talking about the best, not just the best Canadian jazz pianist, but probably the best jazz pianist in the history of the world, in the history of jazz. So did you come to this with a love of jazz, or did you develop that as you got into the film?
I grew up in Montreal in a small home with parents that loved entertainment and loved music. There wasn't a lot of money to go to a lot of things, but the one thing my mother did was that anything that was coming to Place des Arts in Montreal, the performing arts center that was there, that was live, she took me to. And along with that was this record cabinet that people had then, which was stuffed with comedy albums and jazz records. And it wasn't that they said, go listen to them. I just had nothing else to do. It certainly wasn't an academic. And so, once I had worn out the comedy records from, You Don't Have to Be Jewish and Lou Jacoby and Woody Allen and everybody, I would gravitate towards the jazz records and Sarah Vaughan, Etta James, and Oscar Peterson, who I still had no idea he was from Montreal. I wasn't reading the liner notes. And then one day my mother said, okay, Saturday afternoon, we're going to a concert. I go, okay. And I wasn't that thrilled to be going because, I was always happy to go, but last week's concert was Nana Mouskouri, who I'd never heard of, this iconic Greek songstress. And I wasn't that thrilled with the music. And now my mother had another idea, and it's like, let's go see Oscar Peterson. But I had heard the record, so I went, fell in love with him. They had introduced him as Montreal's own. And I went, what? And, went to the library to research him. And that was sort of the first wave, Steve, of loving jazz. And in the early 70s, I would come to Toronto to visit relatives, and this family friend cousin would take me to Sam the Record Man. He was a jazz aficionado at the age of 14 or 15. And we go to Sam's into the jazz section upstairs, many flights up, where you can put a record on and listen to it before you can buy it. And I would hear Charlie Mingus. I would hear Dave Brubeck. I would hear Maynard Ferguson, and fell in love with them. And that was almost the second revolution of jazz. And then the last thing is, and then I'm sure you'll have other questions, is that we used to take my grandfather every summer to Saratoga Springs, New York. And we would drive him there and leave him there for the summer. And we would often go to jazz concerts that were there. And that's where Maynard Ferguson happened to be staying at the same hotel we were at. So I got to meet him and Herb Alpert. And so it was, some great little brushes with fame and some jazz artists, and the jazz stayed with me forever. I'd never planned to make an Oscar Peterson documentary. It just, at that time of my life, a year and a half ago, I was figuring out what I was going to do next, and listening to music, and went, wait a minute, this might be an interesting film.
So I want to congratulate you, because the film is acclaimed. It recently won 3 Canadian Screen Awards, and well, I have 3, so I apologize to you on the sheet that we sent out. So my humble apology.
No, we won one late in the week, a Screen Award for sound mixing and engineering, which to your audience might sound like, well, okay, a technical award, but mixing this film with so many different qualities of recordings from all over the world, from Tokyo to Sweden and Germany and France and whatever, and live performances that we filmed, was really a sound engineering feat. So I'm happy for my team that won that award.
But one of the awards went to you personally for best direction in a documentary program. I just want to briefly refer, there was a bit of a controversy when you accepted your speech. Could you just deal with that and give your answer to that controversy?
Yeah, I mean, that was a moment. I had the film was released in September of last year at the Toronto International Film Festival, and then went on to Crave in October, and then full circle to April of this year, where it won these awards. And one of the awards in my acceptance speech for Best Director of the film, I thanked a lot of people, and at the end of the film, I made a comment about how important that these stories are to be told, and the intention of my words were misinterpreted, sadly, and misunderstood. And in the 15 seconds that I had to accept the award, I didn't potentially choose the right words, because they struck a chord with an organization, and they were upset. They were upset with my acceptance speech, and it was nothing. I intended a message of inclusivity, and they didn't see it as such, and so they were upset about it, and I apologized, and I got a lot of comments and support both ways on that end of it. And it's the pressure of accepting a speech. I mean, those that know my work and know my films and how I work know what was in my heart. But it's the world we're living in terms of making sure that you think about what you say before you say it. But it was a tough not that moment, but it was certainly I made the comments on a Monday night, and on Thursday people were upset. So it was a tough news cycle.
So the title of the film is interesting because it isn't just Oscar Peterson, it's Oscar Peterson black and white. Now, of course, we have the 88 keys on the piano being black and white. Does that title signify more than just the keys on the piano?
It did, and it was a title that came to me, even before we were doing the research on the film. Yes, obviously the keys, the era in which Oscar lived in and experienced tremendous racism while touring through the United States, and certainly experienced racism in Canada. And so certainly that was a reference in that title, as well as, some of the best and iconic performances that were filmed, and including the photography of Oscar was in black and white as well. And so it just seemed like a natural to me. We shot some of the film in black and white, and I love the era. I love that I love things in black and white, and so that just seemed to me a world that he lived in, a world that he had to face, as well as representative of some of the footage that we found.
Okay, so I think this is a good time to watch the trailer for the film, and then I'll follow that up with some questions.
Sure.
I get up in the morning, I think piano. I go to bed at night, I think piano. I am a jazz pianist. That's all I want to be.
Who's at the top of the heap? Oscar.
I didn't know that a piano could be played that fast off the top of your head.
Oscar Peterson is what Muhammad Ali meant to boxing and what Michael Jordan meant to basketball.
Everyone I knew had heard the rumors about this incredible young piano player from, of all places, Montreal. Back then, I didn't even know they had black people in Canada.
Well, I started playing dance halls, I would say around 16 or 17.
After getting a contract with RCA Victor, he was heard by Norman Granz.
He said, well, I'd like you to take a shot at the American jazz market. He said, take your best shot, and if you make it, you'll know it. If you don't make it, you'll know that too.
It was just one of those things.
For Oscar Peterson to arrive as essentially a rookie, but somebody who was so deeply proven at home, It's almost like you're in the big leagues and you're already known as an enormous star. And that set the tone for Oscar Peterson's career.
One of those things.
Coming down to the South, it had to be so shattering in so many ways. Separate bathrooms, the separate water fountains.
Where every heart.
Hymn to Freedom just became the anthem for the civil rights movement in the United States and across the world.
Together
We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality.
He seemed to be having difficulty. I was pretty convinced that Oscar had had a stroke.
Mentally, I was in deep trouble. I wouldn't even listen to music. I saw Brother Oscar in New York right after he had his stroke. He playing the piano with one arm. And you listen to it, look like it's 3 arms.
Oscar Peterson got a send-off today, rarely seen in this country.
There's going to be imitations, there's going to be things that are derivative, but it will never be Oscar.
He was the absolute greatest, man. He was.
So Barry, one of the things that struck me about the movie, and I've seen it a number of times, and we see some of this even in the trailer, is you got some of the greats of jazz.
Yeah.
We're talking about Quincy Jones, Ramsey Lewis, Herbie Hancock. John Batiste just won the Grammy for the best album of the year, jazz album of the year. Branford Marsalis, Billy Joel, and these greats universally revered Oscar Peterson. I mean, we saw some of the quotes, the Ali quote of Ramsey Lewis, and Michael Jordan quote, the Herbie Hancock saying he's the top of the mountain. Did you have just a wealth of choices of people who were prepared to talk about this guy?
No, I mean, if you make documentaries as I have, then, getting people in their busy lives on camera for a film is very, very difficult. Oscar's been gone a while. One of the reasons why I wanted to make the film is that I always felt that if there's a Mount Rushmore of jazz, then his face should be on that mountain. And so, yes, there were lots of people that I wanted. Normally, it becomes a dance of people's schedules, and it's incredibly complex, and they don't get back to you, and no matter how many films you've made. Here's where I got lucky. COVID. And I don't think I'd ever say that before, but when I had come off of doing the Howie Mandel documentary, where of course, he understood COVID and was available, and happy to be available, not have a lot of people around. These musicians that are in this film, this wealth, as you call it, were available because they weren't touring. And so they were more readily available than anybody else that I'd ever had before. And so, if you're Herbie Hancock's not on the road, he's not touring. So it's like, sure. I mean, we'd reached out to Billy Joel on a Friday, and he said, yeah, okay, come over to the house on Sunday. Well, okay, that's great. I now have to figure out a way to travel during COVID from Toronto to New York and get in and do this properly with crews and everything on that end of it. So we were Quincy, we were very, very lucky. I pretty much got everybody I wanted with the exception of Chick Corea, but he had just passed away. So I missed that. And John Batiste had just won the Oscar, actually. And so I didn't think we'd get him, and he's busy with the Colbert Show, but it was great. We pretty much got everybody that we wanted, including, Rosemary Sadler, spectacular Black historian, Dr. Kitty Oliver in the US. And so to understand the significance of Oscars being on the road, we had an abundance of riches, not only in the interviews, but in the footage that we found. And ultimately, that's one of the Canadian Screen Awards we won for my co-producer, Mark Selby, for visual research, because I set him out on the road and said, I want to see stuff I've never seen before. Yes, the CBC archives are spectacular, world class, but find me stuff in Sweden, in Denmark, and and he did.
So you have Dick Cavett interviewed on the program, describing, actually not interviewed, it's from one of his programs. He's interviewing Oscar Peterson, and he describes Oscar as a virtuoso with breathtaking imagination. You interview John Batiste, and he talks about the absolute joy, the joy that comes through as Oscar is playing his piano. You have Herbie Hancock talking about the heart that goes into the notes. You have the Ramsey Lewis talking about the mastery of the piano. And what was it then about this one man, this one jazz pianist, that distinguished him from thousands and thousands of other pianists, jazz pianists who play that same instrument?
I mean, there's several things. I mean, aside from, the brilliance and the ferociousness of his playing, when you watch his hands, and many of the artists in my film talk about that, the fact that he was a prodigy and he had a brilliant ear, the fact that he can go fast or slow. But for me, and I'm not a musician, I just love the music. For me, what really distinguished himself from everybody, and where it took him even beyond Art Tatum, who preceded him and was literally, had written the book on jazz piano on that end of it, was Oscar's generosity towards his fellow musicians in two ways. One, that it was never the Oscar Peterson show, it was the sum of all parts. In fact, he didn't even want to have a solo career. He loved playing with his musicians and understood the equation of the music, and that how essential it was to be generous and to understand everybody's role. And then as a human being, a mensch of mensches, in that everybody wanted Oscar on their album. It wasn't just the 100 albums that he recorded plus he appeared on another 200 with Ella and Nat King Cole and Basie and Ellington. Everybody wanted Oscar, not only because he was a genius, but because he was such a lovely, generous man. And I think Steve too. I mean, one of the stumbling blocks in him being universally recognized as compared to some of the others, whether it is Miles Davis or Coltrane or somebody else, is that there wasn't lots of scandal there. There wasn't drugs and crazy stuff going on. And he decided to spend his formidable years, including the balance of his years, in Canada, not unlike Norman Jewison. So when you're naming, the top cinema directors of all time, many forget Norman. Many of them forget Oscar and jazz because he didn't stay in the club in New York or in LA. He loved Canada. That was his home.
You actually have a part early in the film where you have him on a TV show doing a tribute to the city of Montreal and giving the tribute in French, which I thought was quite touching.
Yeah, he spoke French well on that end of it. And I knew that neighborhood well. So that was quite nice to see. He never forgot literally where he came from.
So we're going to come to this seminal concert, this landmark concert that he gives at Carnegie Hall with Norman Granz.
Performance. That's where he's literally discovered. Yes.
He's discovered. We're going to come to that. But let's talk about the Oscar Peterson before that moment. Just tell us about how he gets to Carnegie Hall. What does he do in Canada that gets him to that moment?
His father, and literally, I think, used piano almost as a form of discipline in keeping his children focused and disciplined. His father worked on, for the CN Railways as a porter, and would disappear for the week and challenge Oscar to learn a piece of music and make sure that it was damn great by the time he got off that train and came home. And Oscar originally was playing the horn and had early medical issues. So I think an early case of TB, if I remember correctly, and moves to can't breathe and have the lung capacity, and moves to the piano quickly on that end of it, and becomes obsessed with the sound as well as his ability to pick things up on that end of it. And of course, he tells the great story of somebody giving him an Art Tatum record and almost being ruined and say, I can never play that well again. In fact, he does play that well and much better, but he starts entering, gets entered into contests in Montreal and then gets on the radio in Montreal. And in fact, I'm getting ahead of myself, but the great jazz impresario and promoter, Norman Granz, who happens to be in Vancouver, he hears him on the radio and dismisses him, and then comes to Montreal and is going to the airport. And again, it hears him on the radio in the taxi and says, who is that? And the taxi driver said, well, that's Oscar Peterson. And he goes, well, where, what recording is that? And the taxi driver thankfully says to him, no, that he's playing live right now from this nightclub in Montreal. And Norman turns the taxi around and goes back and hears him is just completely blown away by this amazing kid of how well he can play, how fast he can play, no sheet music in front of him, and gives him the opportunity of a lifetime to play at Carnegie Hall. Now I should go back and say, who is Norman Granz? Norman Granz was a promoter from the US who elevated jazz as an art form from smoky basements and wanted to bring jazz to an audience that had not really heard jazz before. They might have heard some of it in New York, where audiences were more open-minded, but he wanted jazz to become an art form that was universal. And so he started doing things that were called concerts that were called Jazz at the Philharmonic, recording albums and having concerts. And so he invited Oscar to come to Carnegie Hall to play a number and said, you know what, you might make it, you might not. We'll give you a shot. Let's see how the audience reacts. Now, Oscar was not allowed to go to earn a living in the United States. And he crossed the border and said he was visiting a relative, and he was not even on the bill, given his age and given the fact that he was, again, a Canadian. And so he is introduced, unannounced, as they say, but just brought up from the audience at Carnegie Hall. And you can hear that recording in the film. And he is, that changes him forever. The audience goes crazy. And at a young age, Oscar is now exploded, and Norman Granz is taking him on the road and all over Europe and all over the world. And Oscar,
yeah, we're gonna watch a short of that briefly, but I think it's also important to note, Barry, that not only was Norman Granz this great jazz impresario, was gathering the great jazz musicians and taking them out of clubs and, as he say, noisy restaurants where the waiters made noise, and taking them into concert halls around the world, including Japan. But they were primarily Black musicians. He was giving this extraordinary opportunity to the Ella Fitzgeralds, the Ray Brown, the great musicians who were Black, and treating them, just like any other great musician.
Well, yeah, I mean, Oscar recognized early, as did Norman, that that there was a different sound other than Benny Goodman and Stan Kenton, and that this was a sound that people needed to hear, and also these musicians needed to be elevated, Black musicians, and potentially earn what others are earning, and more importantly, be treated as well, if not better, as the artists and celebrities they are. And that really is, due to Norman looking after these musicians on the road.
Okay, let's watch the short now of Norman Granz.
Well, I was in Montreal then. I took a taxi for the airport, and the cabbie had his radio going, and I heard this wonderful piano playing. I thought it was a disc jockey. At the end of the number, I asked him if he could give me the name of the station. He said, no, that wasn't the station. That was the Alberta Lounge, where there was a group playing Oscar Peterson. And very dramatically said, turn right around and let's go there.
I said, my God, it's Norman Granz. And I couldn't believe that he was sitting in the lounge. He said, well, I'd like you to take a shot at the American jazz market. You invited me to be a guest artist on the Carnegie Hall concert
that fall with Jazz at the Philharmonic. And I remember how reticent I was to even take you up on the offer because I wasn't ready to play in that sort of league.
But you held out for a long time.
Yeah, but it wasn't the right time, really, Anna. It was wrong. I was really immature, personally, mentally, whatever way you want to look at it. I was a kid of 13 when
A 13-year-old kid, their heads would be turned. You have to be pretty objective about yourself to say, I have to hone my craft and I'm going to do it.
Oh, I didn't say it. My mother and father said it. I was trying to talk them into it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But they said, no, not a 13. We don't want you smoking pot till you're 21.
I finally agreed to do it. He decided it should be at Carnegie Hall. He said, take your best shot and you'll know in one shot. If you make it, you'll know it. If you don't make it, you'll know that too.
I can listen to that all day.
Yeah, no, I know. And that was a cold spring day, as you describe in the movie. You were gathered a number of Canadian musicians. We saw Joe Seeley from Halifax playing the piano there, and all a tribute to Oscar Peterson. That's the beginning of the film and throughout the film. But just, I mean, here you have this Oscar Peterson actually being called up. Norman Grant says, you're now going to hear Oscar Peterson. And he hasn't even played with Ray Brown, the bass player, one of the great bass players in history. And they get up there and they just blow the audience away. And, and this is the show. This is the hall, still is the hall in the world. And Oscar Peterson stood up and as he said, that was the moment his international career took off, right? That was it. But he was still already, by that point, a big name, at least in Canada, but certainly that catapulted him into
he was. And if you think about it, who gets to audition at Carnegie Hall in front of a live audience? It wasn't, Norman took him to Birdland and said, all right, let me try you in a small club. And if you can hack it, and it's Carnegie Hall, it was sink or swim, and he gets it done. And I just want to comment, Steve, I mean, that clip where you mentioned Joe Seeley, Larnell Lewis, Dave Young, who one of the last musicians to play with Oscar and his trio, our play. And that structure of the film that we chose was, again, during COVID, getting musicians back into a studio who had not been performing for a year. We're so desperate to work and thrilled to have them. And so we went into a sound stage and recorded about 6 or 7 songs, Peterson, as an homage to him, and also helped the structure of the film, because Oscar's music is like a freight train. And I felt that if we had these sort of interludes of music playing, it gave the audience a bit of a break and fall in love with the music all over again in a contemporary setting. And really that was inspired by another film that I saw called Standing in the Shadows of Motown, where literally in between the history of the Funk Brothers and Motown Detroit, there were these great musical interludes of their music. And I wanted to do the same with this film.
Right. So you spoke about Art Tatum, who was one of his role models, who he became friends with in 1950, very close friends, as he describes in the film. But another was Nat King Cole.
Yeah.
And he loved Nat King Cole's singing voice, but also his piano playing. And he modeled his trio after Nat King Cole. Herbie Hancock talks about that, and I think you have a quote from Oscar as well. And the trio consisted of a guitar player, piano, and a bass, and that was the great first trio of Oscar Peterson. And the guitar eventually gets replaced by a drum player and a drum, but that he moves into a trio, and that's the next phase of his career. Am I right about that?
That's correct. And then ultimately, as a solo career, and it's Count Basie, I believe, who convinces him that he can have a solo career on that end of it. But yes, I mean, and again, that's back to that point about the evolution of the musicians he plays with and the generosity that and love that they had for each other.
Right. And some, we see some of the records, you flash the record labels during the movie. We're talking about he must have made 100 records. I was counting them as I watched, but it was just extraordinary, prolific production of records.
I mean, he says at the beginning of the film, I came to play, and that he did. He loved performing.
All right. And then he was in Verve Records, where he started accompanying all of the artists, and Stan Getz, you've mentioned some of the others, and everyone wanted Oscar Peterson on the piano to accompany them. And the great thing I thought about Oscar Peterson, when you're accompanying someone, you're a bit in their shadow. You're not standing out. It's not your gig. You're essentially second to them. That had to say a lot about his character, that he was prepared to do that.
Yeah, I mean, again, that he always, if you watch those performances, he always let a fellow musician shine and have their moment and within the set. And again, it wasn't just the Oscar show. He really appreciated the alchemy of his sound.
All right, so let's deal now with an important part of the film. It's about 11 minutes, and that's Oscar Peterson's experience with racism.
Yeah.
And he describes it as the worst moment of his life, confronting racism. And that's how bad it was. And you can see that it surprised him. It was certainly, now he may have had, episodes of racism in Canada growing up. I'm not dismissing that, but certainly he didn't come to a hotel in Dallas, Texas before, with an effigy hanging from the largest hotel of a black man, it didn't have signs saying, blacks not allowed here, whites only. So let's talk a bit about Oscar Peterson confronting racism. Some of it's with Norman Granz, he's dealing with it, and traveling through the American South. How did he deal with that?
Well, again, as you suggested, there certainly were episodes in Canada. Nobody was immune to this. And not being an expert in any of this, and I was not aware of what musicians had suffered on the road specifically until I saw the film Green Book, and said, look, I really have to explore this in the film. And as I researched what inspired his song "Hymn to Freedom," and we'll come back to that song. So that's why specifically I went to Rosemary Sadler, as a former head of the Black Historical Association in Ontario, and Dr. Kitty Oliver, a spectacular Black historian in the United States, to help me unpack this and unpack Oscar's experience on the road. Again, he had had experiences in Canada. He had been told that it was going to be rough on the road, but nothing to what it was like to be experienced in person. And here's the interesting thing, is that Oscar was a teddy bear of a man. He loved playing, and he loved his audiences. He loved getting to know people and meet them. He loved shaking hands. And that's what he was used to in New York and in, Montreal or Toronto, on that end of it. Once he got to the South, he would go to a venue, and, and there were signs along the way of, yes, he'd have to stay in a hotel only for Black people, and that, he'd have to use a separate entrance, and restaurants, and all kinds of racism that was offensive to him and upsetting, but nothing confrontational as compared to playing an extraordinary performance in the Carolinas, where the audience was uproarious in their applause. And then he would go to do a meet and greet, which he wanted to do on that end of it. And he would go back, and the fans would be there, and he'd be excited. And they would say, "Mr. Peterson, that was spectacular. That was the greatest performance we've ever seen." And he'd say, "Thank you." And he'd put his hand out to shake their hand or go and hug them. And they go, "No. I loved your performance. I'm not going to shake your hand." And that to him was brutal and frightening and discouraging. And so you add that layer on, and he talks about this in the film, the loneliness of then going back to that motel alone, because if you wanted to go out and eat, then, you only can go to certain restaurants, they weren't open. And so you go back to your hotel room and you're miserable, or you go back, or you finish a performance and you need to go to the bathroom, and And the manager of the theater that Norman had booked, what we call a four-wall deal, they booked the theater for that night, would say, oh, no, you can't use the bathroom in the theater. There's an outhouse in the back, go to that. And those were some of the more non-violent experiences. And then, there were situations where the police would pull them over and were very aggressive. And so it was rough for him. And, Norman suggested that he write about it. It was a time of civil rights. There were marches, Martin Luther King, and that, he contribute something to this voice to articulate his frustration and what he wanted his message to be. And so he wrote Hymn to Freedom.
Okay.
Kat, you're going to play a clip. I take it. Okay.
Well, we're going to talk about Hymn to Freedom, because it's just such an important anthem in the civil rights movement. But the important thing is that he experienced it, but he also stood up to it. I mean, you described that outhouse story, but he didn't just go to the outhouse outside. He said, no, bring Norman in here. That's not happening. Which I thought was
exactly right. And Norman becomes, who's white. Norman becomes, somewhat legendary in the story, where he would say, you know what, I won't, if you're going to make my musicians stay in that motel, I'll stay with them. I mean, certain things that you just couldn't overturn at that time, but he would also fight and say, I'm sorry, they're going to eat in that restaurant. They're going to, they're going to use that bathroom. And I booked this theater, and Norman did stand up for his musicians, including Oscar, time and time and time again.
Yeah, and there's one episode buried in the film where I think it's a Dallas cop puts his gun in Norman Grantz's chest when he tries to put Ella Fitzgerald in a cab.
Yeah, exactly.
She's not going in the cab, and Grant says, "Oh yes, she is." And
Yeah.
he stands him down, and eventually she gets in that cab. Which was very
Norman, really, I mean, again, to even book these artists in the South on that end of it, and knowing what he was going to confront on that end of it. But it was so important for him for that part of the United States to hear a form of music that they might have known Creole and a different kind of music that was influenced by different people, but to hear this form of jazz and hear that music that art form was important to him.
Yeah, so here we have a Canadian composing the most important anthem for civil rights, and as you point out in the film through the historian, it was really a tribute to Martin Luther King and in his path to overcome injustice through peaceful resistance, not through violence. And so it becomes this anthem of not just the civil rights movement in the United States, but around the world. It's picked up by Martin Luther King Jr. You have this wonderful moment where you have Martin Luther King speaking about, young Black children having to know they can't sit in certain areas because it says whites only, this very power vignette from one of his incredible speeches. And then words are put to the music, and it's just carried on as the most important piece of music in the world today, dealing with racial injustice. There's no doubt about that. And it's Oscar Peterson. And John Batiste makes this point. Thank God he actually kept a record of it. And in fact, it's used by Barack Obama with the children's choir when he has his inauguration in 2008. So Hymn to Freedom, will stand forever and will always be connected to Oscar Peterson.
If you listen to the lyrics, and certainly the music is timeless, but the lyrics are timeless as well. And that anthem of "We need to come together" is so beautiful and so poignant on that end of it. And then, specifically in the film, we have the great, iconic Jackie Richardson singing it. And that's what I envisioned. It was a moment when she sang it in the studio, and when we filmed it and she finished, we all stood there for 20 minutes lost in it. And wow. Yeah, it's a great moment.
Yeah. And Peterson says, I don't mean to brag, but it did better And I believed in my wildest dreams. It's a very, one of the things I found about Oscar Peterson is that he was so human, that you just could relate. He just could relate to this guy. He just seemed so normal, so average. I loved when he thanked the Queen for coming. She's sitting there in Carter Hall and she's staring at him like, who are you telling me, thanking me to come to Canada? Who do you think you are? I'm the Queen. That's a great, I don't know if you saw it the same way, but that's the way I saw it, Barry. And
I mean, because Oscar was so great at storytelling, aside from being a musician, it's one of the reasons, in that I wanted Mark Selby, my producer, to find these interviews, because I wanted this to be Oscar's story in this film. It's Oscar's story. It's not my story. It's not anybody's story. So I wanted him to tell his story in this film. And that's why we spent hours and hours going through miles and miles of footage to construct the interviews from every decade of his life to tell his story from the beginning to the end.
And he was also very articulate too.
Very.
So he died in 2007, let's just say that. So one of the challenges, of course, you had for this film, which is self-evident, is you couldn't interview your subject, right? Which you do, I'm sure, in many of the documentaries that you do. So you had to reconstruct it through others, through the lens of others, and through interviews. Did you find interviews that hadn't been uncovered before?
Oh, for sure, for sure. Performances and interviews that had, from various parts of the world that have never been seen in North America before, as well as performances, and some footage that, from the great archives of the CBC that haven't been seen in 50 years on that end of it or more. So, oh yeah, for sure. I mean, we thankfully had a lot to work with.
So you dealt with Oscar Peterson's personal life, which was complicated, and it's talked about in the film. And indeed, Oscar Peterson talks about it quite openly, that he had 3 failed marriages, and we're going to come to his 4th marriage soon. He was on the road all the time, barely saw his children. He makes a joke that he would, was good on the telephone, but clearly his personal life suffered as a result of becoming this iconic jazz musician who was in demand everywhere around the world.
Yeah, I mean, there's a loneliness, as I alluded to, on the road. And this is not an uncommon thing amongst entertainers, where, it is intoxicating to play and to be on the road and to be adored and to hear the applause, and so and to be as disciplined and obsessed with continuing to perform. And that certainly, as Oscar suggested, and he's not alone in it, took a major toll on his family life, and he accepts responsibility for that on that end, and suffers because it's he's lonely. There's no question. You're on the road and lonely. And the difference between him versus others, that I remember being on the stage with the Rolling Stones and at the SARS concert in Toronto way back when, and just walking on the stage for a moment. And I don't know how many, I can't remember, it was hundreds of thousands that were there at that Molson Park, and feeling the noise and the heat and the force of the crowd and the applause being directed towards the Rolling Stones, and it's intoxicating. They weren't there for me, but you could feel how exciting it would be. And so you play a concert like Oscar did, or the Stones, you leave and then go to a hotel room, because you can't go to a restaurant. And so you go to a hotel room, and some choose to be alone, like Oscar did, lost in your thoughts, no computers at that time or cell phones. And some chose drugs and alcohol to replicate and emulate that high of that crowd, as did Janis Joplin, many, and they've said this, how do I feel as high as I did when I'm on the stage? So I'll do drugs. Oscar didn't.
So we come to his 4th wife, Kelly, who he meets. She's the manager of a dining room in a crab restaurant, and they strike, and he invites her to New York, and from there they ultimately, they get married and have this loving, wonderful relationship and have a beautiful daughter. But I found it interesting. She described the latter part of Oscar Peterson's life, where he suffers a stroke, and his recovery from the stroke and his ability to play again in New York, not that long after he suffers that stroke.
Amazing. Yeah, he suffers a stroke, and one of his friends notices it when he's playing at the Blue Note and he's missing a few notes, and he thinks it's something wrong with the piano and the pedal. But no, he is, he finally, Kelly gets him to a doctor, and he has a stroke and has to, loses the ability to use one of his hands, right hand, I believe, and then finally gets most of it back. And it was Dave Young and several other musicians who encouraged him to get back on it. He was going to give it up and was so depressed at not being able to play like Mercury. But, almost a year later, he goes back to the Blue Note in New York, where he first experienced symptoms of a stroke, and plays again. And you see it in the film, in a concert in Vienna that was filmed, where he is extraordinary. And so he does overcome. I mean, he has health issues for the back end of his life, but he does overcome the stroke. And I don't think he ever believed he can play as well as he did, but for, the average person watching him, unless you're going to put a piece of film next to another piece of film, even with, the recovering from a stroke, he was still one of the most extraordinary players ever.
One of the things, that's remarkable about Oscar Peterson is that he played equally well with both hands, and that's unique for piano players. But it's also, John Batiste said that when he listened as a young boy to Oscar Peterson records, he thought there were actually two people playing the piano. That's how skilled he was.
Well, it's insane. I mean, when I work with my editor on the film, the first cut of the film we got, and I listened, and Oscar, that playing, as I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, was so ferocious that it was like relentless playing. And I said to him, Nicholas, great editor, Nicholas, we have to find a way to slow this down. An audience can't watch this documentary for 3 hours. Was the first cut we knew wasn't going to be 3 hours, but they can't keep up with this breathless pace of Oscar's playing, even within the storytelling, because it's insane.
Yeah, one of the things I took from the film, Barry, wasn't just his skill at playing the piano, but it was his range and versatility. Because one of the things about jazz, and I love jazz as much as you do, is that you can't define jazz. It can be funky, it can be swing, it can be powerful, it can be light, it can be tender, it can have beautiful emotions. Just look at Norah Jones and compare it, to Oscar Peterson playing swing on the piano.
Diana Krall, sure.
And he could play it all, though. That's the thing. He could play that tender ballad, and you have one in the movie, and then he could be you just watching him swing and.
He knew the instrument, Steve. He knew the instrument. He was also a great singer, but he rarely sang, and so he just understood music. And as I said, the entire equation of how the instrument worked, how his hands worked, how his voice worked. I mean, and he loved it. He loved it. Some musicians are tortured. Miles Davis, who I worked with, tortured, not him.
And he played till the end. I mean, he died in 2007, but he was still playing right concerts.
Pretty close, pretty much, yeah.
Pretty close to the end. So let's talk now. We have a few minutes remaining about the legacy of Oscar Peterson. And I want to ask you, a very candid question about Canada, because sometimes we don't treat the great iconic figures with the recognition that they deserve. And so here you have, the best. I mean, we're talking about Muhammad Ali at the piano. We have a statue on Parliament Hill. Through Kelly's excellent work, we have these annual concerts at Kerner Hall where they actually utilize Oscar Peterson's piano, and they're always sold out, and they draw great audiences. But do you, frankly, now that you look back at this and you've immersed yourself in the life of this great man, do you think he has enough recognition in this country?
Well, it's a really hard question. I mean, I've been very vocal.
I didn't want to ask you an easy one.
Yeah. Thanks. I mean, I've been very vocal about the fact that Canadians are not great giving the recognition to Canadians, to fellow Canadians, which is why so many of them leave. I would have loved to see more of these honors given to Oscar while he was alive, and there certainly were. I mean, he got doctorates and various things, but naming theaters and schools and statues after him are great, and that helps. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to make the film and let it be seen in all over the world, and people go back and listen to the music. Many musicians are, even rap musicians are going back and sampling an Oscar, and I'm influenced by his style. So I'm happy for that. But I just think it's an important lesson for Canadians to not be so nudgy about stardom and about saying, oh, he's getting too big, she's getting too big, and we have to make sure people are celebrated while they're living too.
All right. Well, I want to be an advocate for an Oscar Peterson stamp, Barry. So will you join me in that?
Well, there is an Oscar Peterson stamp.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a stamp.
Okay, good. I didn't.
Diana Krall was at the unveiling of that. So
okay, good.
And I believe there's a Salome Bay one coming out now too, which is great.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, in any event, I think we've covered the gamut. It's just before 8 o'clock. And thank you for making this film. I do want to ask you how, because I'm sure the audience wants to know this, how can they access the film? How can people watch this movie?
In Canada, it's on Crave. And if you don't have Crave, then you can go on, CTV on demand and see it there. And then eventually it'll find its place. It'll find itself in other places. But right now it's on Crave and CTV.
All right. Well, I highly recommend it. And Barry, it's a joy as always. I want to thank you for being on another edition of the Evenings with Steve, answering my hard questions. And no, it's always a joy here,
Anytime, my pleasure.
Okay. And thank you to everyone. I just want you to know something about our program coming up in June, because we do have a couple of minutes, and Barry, you'll bear with me. We're going to do a very different kind of program on June 8th. It's going to be called Wine, Vines, and Israel. And we're going to look, with the benefit of a sommelier or sommeliers, at Israeli wine, the best of Israeli wine, and some kosher wine, not from Israel. And it's going to be interactive. We're going to send you out a list of the wines we're going to look at. We're going to encourage you to buy one or two of the bottles so that you have them in your home and enjoy the wine as the sommelier reviews it. We're going to talk about food pairings. We're going to talk, have a sophisticated discussion about Israeli wine and kosher wine. And I'm very much looking forward to that. Very different kind of program. That'll be our last Zoom program. And in the fall, we're going to move to Beth Sholem Synagogue, or Evenings with Steve. And Barry, you're going to be there with me. We're going to do it in person, and we're going to live stream it and hopefully continue these wonderful programs. But they're only wonderful because we have guests like Barry Avrich, and we have wonderful people like you spending an hour of your evening with us, and we greatly appreciate it. Stay on for the wonderful music of Nora Jones and John Legends. Happy Passover. Good evening, everyone. Take care.